back. Hopefully everyone's enjoyed the poster session and lunch. We'll start back with our next set of talks. Today we're going to hear from Roy Berns on color and spectral archiving using dual RGB imaging. Roy is the Richard Hunter Professor in Color Science, Appearance, and Technology, and Director of the Munsell Color Science Laboratory, the Center for Image Science at Rochester Institute of Technology. He has a BS and MS degrees in textile from the University of California, Davis, and a PhD in chemistry from Rensselaer or Polytech. I should have just said RPI. He's the author of the third edition of Bill Meyer and Schlitzman's Principles of Color Technology. His main area of research focus is using color and imaging science for the visual arts. I will hand it over to Roy. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason, for the nice introduction. Thanks, everybody, for coming back after the poster session. And thanks for introducing my poster session. That was great. What I'd like to talk about today is something that we've been doing, which is kind of an alternate approach to RTI. It's a different way of gathering similar information. And we're calling it four-light total appearance imaging of paintings. So this is a bunch of different pictures of Starry Night taken from different angles, and obviously we can see that there is quite rich texture in this painting, and we like to capture that information, yet normally when a photographer takes this dynamic experience and reduces it to a single image, right? So the photographer is looking at it, we can look at it from different orientations, but the photograph is a single view of this. And so the idea here is, can we start to capture information so that we retain more of this dynamic experience? And so the research goals for this work would then be to record appearance properties of paintings and drawings so that computer graphics can be then used to render the artwork. So then the angle of view and the lighting geometry is a decision that's made at the end, not at the beginning. We'd also like to develop hardware and software that's appropriate to be used in a museum imaging department, and then finally to try to capture some data to provide new and rich content. So what can we do if we had such data? So this is the idea of total appearance imaging, and to do this, you have three main areas of information that have to be captured. The first is spectral data, which can then be used to define color. Then there's the surface microstructure, which we can kind of think about as gloss. And typically what's measured here is the bidirectional reflectance distribution function, or BRDF. So this is giving you information about how an object is glossy or not glossy as a function of view angle. And then there's the surface macrostructure, which can be thought of, well, it can be defined two ways. One is either a height map, and that would be the equivalent of what we've been hearing about up until, I think, this moment through the photogrammetry and laser scanning, or there's something called the surface normal, which is giving you shading information, and the surface normal is the angle which is perpendicular to the surface of an object. So if you have a curve, the surface normal is going to be changing in its direction, and that surface normal can then be used as a way to introduce shading in graphics rendering. So for colorimetry, we've been using a dual RGB approach. So in this case, it's a Canon Mark II camera. So there's the camera. There's a filter wheel here that we've designed and built in order to then capture a pair of RGB images. We're using Broncolor strobes, and that the calibration is being done with a color checker classic target measured with an I1 spectrophotometer. This is kind of typical of the calibration accuracy of this system. And so in this case, I'm making a plot of A star versus B star, a C-lab. And the goal is that all the arrows, which would be airs, the arrowheads are within the filled dot, which is the calibration color. So this is telling me that my system can give high accuracy as long as my paintings have similar properties, in this case, to a color checker. And this is the kind of spectral accuracy that's typical of this system. So again, it's not perfect, but it's not bad considering that it's way undersampled spectrally. The surface microstructure is coming from an artist material database. So we had a project in the past in which we prepared, I think, around 100 different panels, well, different samples, and these materials were all painted using different painting techniques, painting materials, egg tempera, oil, acrylic, drawing materials, pencil, and that each one of these samples has been measured in order to characterize their BRDF. And using the Ward model, we then have a BRDF library. So in our image rendering, you can choose then what surface properties you'd like to impose on that object. This type of imaging does not capture spatially varying gloss. So it's a diffuse imaging technique. Then the gloss gets imposed during the rendering process. The surface macrostructure is then we're using polarization enhanced photometric stereo. So here you can see that there's a light source here, here, and here, and that we're using polarization, cross polarization. This is in the Museum of Modern Art in the Paintings Conservation Lab. This is a Jackson Pollock painting. Here you can see a four-light version of this in my laboratory at RIT. And the idea that these four lights are then at 180 degrees apart, aimed at 45 degrees towards the painting. And so in this case, I can then capture with conventional lighting and with this photometric stereo method where we're then capturing four successive images, each light being shot one at a time. So then, and with the cross polarization, I'm only then measuring diffuse light. So one of the requirements for photometric stereo is that the scene is diffuse. So calibration, we have some linear polarizers because the camera's got a circular polarizer. I've got to set its state of polarization. We then have a diffuse whiteboard attached to a metal plate, and then we're using that in order to then do flat fielding and to allow for cosine fall off, and also because our light sources are not point lights. There's a black cue ball that's imaged, and the black cue ball is used both to determine cross polarization, so that when you're looking for the specular peak to be minimized in its energy, as well as to define the position of the four lights very precisely. And then we're imaging a color checker, and then there's a transformation of our dual RGB images to floating point images. So we've been, for this application, we're generating floating point images that are encoded in sRGB. So when you display them on screen, they look reasonable. So here's this idea of the specular highlight. We have a cue ball that's on I drilled a 420 into it, and so that it attaches to a boom. Looks like a microphone stand. So we've written software that does the colorimetry. There's calibration and processing in order to take the flat field images, the cue ball images, define the lighting, and then to calculate the surface normals for a given image. And then we've written two pieces of software so that we can have software that can read our image format, which is PFMs. One is Art Viewer, and we drew heavily upon the software that Chi developed. So I have to thank them for providing the prototype for the software. So we have the kind of usual stuff where you can change your view angle. One of the things we added to this was we wanted to be able to render images that were typical of studio lighting. And so you can define studio lights at 45 degrees, and you can even change their relative energy if you want to create the equivalent of a rendering, such as a painting that's done in normal studio. We also wrote something that's similar to HDR Shop so that we can then quantitatively analyze and view the floating point images called IC. So we've tested this at MoMA. These are the paintings that we've imaged. at different time periods. And if you're familiar with these paintings, you'll know they are not to scale, especially this poly. I was trying to lay them out in a way that kind of looked pleasing, and then I just started laughing because I thought, oh my gosh, this is so not correct. But you know, life's too short, so I just wrote not. That's a good thing. Whenever things are not going your way, you just write not to scale. So this is a painting that I made specifically for this type of 3D imaging. It has some amount of impasto, and I also added a gloss medium selectively to the painting. So there's different, this has got spatially varying gloss. It's turned out that I had used the painting as a way to get funding. It's also given me, some people have made fun of me for the painting as well. The first time I showed this at the National Gallery, after about a half hour into the meeting, they're like, Roy, could you like turn that thing over? So anyway, this is my nod to the Fauves, so okay. Anyway, it also has dioxazine purple, which is kind of a challenging pigment to image, so now I can see if my 2 days of fiddling around with the projector has paid off. So it's not bad, not bad. So this is conventional imaging where we're using the two strobes at 45 degrees. So this is kind of typical of at least the way we tend to photograph paintings in our laboratory. This is the diffuse image. So this is the average of the four lights without any gloss. And as you can see, of course, it generates a very gloss, soft effect here. A lot of the detail in the canvas can't be seen. And what's interesting is that this type of photography is actually typical of the Museum of Modern Art because they tend to like to generate fairly soft images with their lighting setup in their photo studio. This is the four light approach in which we've rendered using to try to match the conventional lighting. And again, you can see some amount of highlight detail is now coming back. This is RTI system. So at MoMA, there's an RTI dome system. So the image, we had this painting image there. And you can see in this case, because the lighting from the art, so we then chose an angle that was as similar as possible to the angles of our conventional lighting. And you can, one of the things you see here is there are black lines because the lighting is much more directional than what's conventional lighting, so we're getting stronger shadows here. So you can see you're getting good representation of the surface properties. We also had the painting laser scan with an Arias 3D up in Canada, and what was pretty gratifying to me was that the surface normals that are coming out of our four-light approach are quite close to the laser scan. So I was pretty happy that this very abridged method is doing a good job at pulling out surface properties. We've then recently done some visual psychophysical testing in which we've compared different approaches here. The strobes with soft boxes. We used the laser scanning for the surface normal, the dual RGB for the diffuse color. We looked at the 3-light imaging, 4-light imaging, the RTI, and then we have a very complicated system that's using polarized enhanced linear light source reflectometry, which would be a separate presentation. So what was done is we're doing a paired comparison experiment. Let's look at this first. So every image is compared pairwise to the actual painting. We then set up the painting to be lit from one angle, and then all the images were similarly rendered. So we tried to have the rendering to match the lighting. We've then matched white points and luminance. So you can see an observer looking at the screen. It's a split screen, so they could freely look back and forth and move their heads around. And then we asked different questions. First, paintings were evaluated, and we asked the question, which image looks most like the real painting? So just kind of the naive question, which do you think looks closest? And then we went in for more specific questions about gloss and shininess, texture, and then finally color. So these are the images in this case for what we're calling total appearance. And what I was hoping for would be that some of these systems would, I sort of see conventional lighting as my benchmark in this case, because this is the typical museum approach to photography, and I'm trying to create a system that can both mimic conventional photography and allow all this extra data to be available. So that's sort of what I'm looking for in this approach. And you can see here in this case that these are, so what's being plotted here is this is the perceptual result versus each system. And these are the averages, and this is the visual uncertainty based on the 25 observers. And if the mean value does not intersect the error bars, then there's a statistically significant difference. So for this particular painting, the 4-light image was statistically superior to the other images. Here we can see that the laser, conventional, and linear were the same, and then you have these different categories. The conventional softbox, so this is the soft imaging, was the least preferred approach. And again, if it makes sense because of how the lighting system was set up to be 60 degrees. This is a second image, which is a fake Van Gogh that I bought in Chinatown in LA, and I cut it, wow, to fit as a 12 by 12. So it's a riff on, I guess, one of his Wheatfield images. And here we can see that the conventional was the best. And again, but the basic sort of trends are the same, where the conventional is the poorest. This was an image of tulips that was painted to have a moderate level of impasto. And again, you can see the same kind of trends, except in this case, the 3-light approach was the poorest. So here we can see the average results, and so that we're going then from conventional 4, the linear, the most complicated system, to 3, the RTI system, and then conventional. We then wanted to look at more details about image shininess and gloss, and the RTI 4-light and laser do not generate gloss information directly. Oh, well, that's not true. RTI has it built into it because it is measuring gloss in there. And so this linear system has the most information compared to conventional. And so again, you could kind of see these results. Conventional softbox, again, the worst. Texture. In the case of texture, we added in the surface normal map, so you can do a rendering from the surface normal. We also did a lightness and chroma histogram equalization of the RTI image in order to have it more closely matched. One of the reasons I didn't use this in the other experiments is that when we're doing this sort of color enhancement in order to make it more similar, it was then reducing some of the texture that's apparent in the image. So I didn't like the idea that I was losing appearance attributes, so that was why we didn't do this in the other experiments. And I was hoping that in this case, the surface normal maps would be the best for texture. I mean, that would be what you'd expect. And we found that to be true. So in this case, the 4-light surface normal was the best. Laser was also good. And the thing and here you can see with this was the thing that I was concerned with, that here's the RTI image, and then when I did the equalization here, I'm losing information about texture. So that was why I was worried about this. So as we would expect, these surface normal maps are very useful. Color. Conventional 4 and the linear systems were all about the same. The diffuse and the soft boxes were least preferred, and I was surprised by this. so that observers do feel that having some amount of information about surface topography is important even when you're judging color. So in conclusion, the polarization enhanced stereo dual RGB imaging seems like a viable approach for archiving paintings. The four-light approach can be implemented pretty easily with the strobes and a regular digital camera. So I think it would fit in quite well with a normal studio. I found it interesting that naive observers didn't require spatially varying information when judging total appearance. The softbox and RTI worst conveyed total appearance for this set of observers, whereas the four-light surface normal best conveyed texture. In the future, I'd like to repeat these experiments with museum personnel, do more testing, and then improving our software. Thank you for your attention.